Okay, it's now time to go through Darwin, and he is one of the more, I'd say, one of the more popular readings I do in the class, because it's so, actually reading Darwin in the original, many students haven't done. They've only heard about it. They've never actually read it. And it's different than what people commonly understand. And this is one of the full editions of it. It's quite a book, and it's some of the things to understand about it. I gotta say, it's a magnificent book, but there are a lot of misconceptions about the book and about Darwin that have floated around, and there is the contemporary common debate that goes on about him that is entirely misguided. That's the debate which you've already heard me comment on. Between creationism and evolution. That falls into the category of a false dichotomy. It's putting two things up against each other that really have no business together. Okay, it's like asking who's the better hockey team, the Lakers or the Dodgers. Excuse me. So this evolutionary theory has no bone to pick with religious faith. It just doesn't. If you understand both of the areas, you would understand that. If you're ignorant about how they work, you will fall for that fight. You will start arguing, God forbid, for the Dodgers or something like that. So don't argue for the Dodgers. So don't fall into those debates. Those are popular debates, and they are built upon false reasoning. So Darwin, a little bit about him. He one of the reasons he writes so incredibly well, and if you go into a science, and even if you don't, I would encourage you to read the book. It'll dispel a lot of the myths you've picked up over the years from various people, and it will help you dispel their myths. It's incredibly well written, is what it is. That's what I'm struck by. It is probably the best piece of writing we may read this semester. So what he does, though, is some of the myths I've heard over the years is that he just generated it really fast. No, he took decades to produce the book. Okay, he published it first in 1859. He had done his explorations on the Beagle in the 30s. May have been in the 1830s. He had spent decades on it, and he became an animal breeder, a pigeon breeder, and other things, and worked for decades on it, was part of a scientific society during the time he worked on it. But he was trained as an Episcopal minister. That's often not mentioned. And his wife was very religious. He was, later on in life, agnostic. But it had nothing to do with his scientific work. It had everything to do with the fact that one of his children died. And that struck him really hard and made him agnostic. Not atheist, but agnostic. Those issues of religion are entirely up to you. Those are convictions. Those work differently. Evolution is not something anybody can believe in. If somebody says they believe in it, then they misunderstand it. It's something you either understand or do not understand, because during the 20th century, evolutionary theory under the basic parameters that Darwin set out became extraordinarily reliable. Okay, so it is an area of the biological sciences that has been tested again and again and again. In the way that Popper spells out, and it's been subjected to the kind of methods that Bacon spelled out to empirical methods to search for evidence and make observations, and it was developed. The studies were developed through inferences and other things that were testing it that would have dismissed it. Just genetics alone, the field of genetics, could have easily have dismissed natural selection. Darwin, it's extremely important to understand, did not understand genetics in the least. Genetics contributed. to natural selection. It showed it is an area far more than Eddington's experiment on Einstein. It's an area that showed it to be reliable. They found its same mechanisms working out in genetics. And again, he did not have an understanding of genetics. He actually had a copy of Mendel's study on peas on his bookshelf, but he never read it because the pages were never cut open. That's how you read books, was you cut open the page by page as you read the book. Darwin had not read the book, so he did not understand Mendel. The person he read is somebody we've read this semester. It's somebody he read very carefully. And you might think about that for a bit. I will tell you by the end of this video who it was. It's not the person you probably think it is, because again, he never read Mendel. But he was a well-read man. So let me go through this. This is 1859, and this is going to take a little bit to get through him. But once you get it, it's shockingly powerful. And it's going to take me a bit to get through this first paragraph, because this paragraph lays the foundation for everything that follows. If you don't understand notions of variation, heredity, and other things, you will not follow the rest of what he's writing about. And this is what he says. He sets out, how will the struggle for existence, discussed too briefly in the last chapter. And this is, by the way, from chapter 4 in this book. And by the way, I think this is an excellent chapter to anthologize. If you see Darwin in any other book, it's almost certainly going to be a selection from chapter 4. But again, I want to emphasize the whole book is fascinating. How will the struggle for existence, discussed too briefly in the last chapter, act in regard to variation? Now, variation, even though Darwin did not understand genetics, he was no dummy. He saw that from generation to generation, there is a little bit of a difference. The parents may have been so tall, but the child is that tall. And the parents may have had their fingers, so long, and the child has them this long. Little variations happen from generation to generation. He knew that. It's a genetic mutation. That's what it is. Mutations happen every single generation just through the workings of reproduction. Okay, but he called it variation. That there are going to be variations inevitably. There's always. Can the principle of selection, which we have seen is so potent in the hands of man, apply in nature? I think it can act most effectually. Now, the important thing here is by Darwin's day, domestic selection was well known. How to do it? How do you make a smaller dog? You take these 4 dogs and take the 2 smaller ones, breed them, and then you have 7 or 8 dogs and take the smallest. That is natural selection. Okay. And we know this works because it's gone on in animal agriculture, let alone in plants and farming, for millennia, literally for millennia. Humans have selected animals and plants that they prefer. And it's very important to understand from the beginning that Darwin's theory applies to all living things. Okay? So what he's saying is that the process of selection that we understand from domestication, what I'm going to write about is that this process is going on in nature. Okay? But there's going to be a very big difference. Under domestication, it may be truly said that the whole organization, by organization he means organic being. Okay? Whether or not you're talking about a celery plant, or you're talking about a Joshua tree, or you're talking about, a weasel, or you're talking about an elephant, okay? The whole organization, we might say organism today, becomes in some degree plastic. Well, now the material of plastic wasn't invented, but plastic, the material, means that it can be it's pliable. So he says the whole organization, in other words, the structure of that animal, the structure of that species comes into question. The pressure on a dog over the course of 7 or 8, let alone 20 generations, could be to make it smaller or larger, faster or slower, fluffy or whatever. But the whole animal is under some degree is to some degree plastic. can be changed. Let it be borne in mind how infinitely complex and close-fitting are the mutual relations of all organic beings to each other and to their physical conditions of life. This is very important. This is the primary difference between natural beings and domestic beings. A natural being must be fitted extraordinarily well to every aspect of its environment, both the living environment, the trees, the plants, the other animals, and its inorganic elements, the sand, the wind, the sun, the rain. Both it must be fitted to. If it does not have an ability to live in the cold, it cannot live at 5,000 feet in altitude. It's not going to make it. If it can't live in heat, it's not going to make it in the 100-degree weather. It's going to wilt. So it's got to be suited to those inorganic conditions of life, but also to the other animals around it, to the prey that it might hunt, to the predators that might hunt it, to the food it might eat if it doesn't have anything to do with any carnivorous animals, to the plants. It must be able to digest them in one way or another. Okay, so the digestive juices that it has in its stomach and its internal linings must be able to handle the plants in the environment. That's what he's talking about with a very close-fitting relationship. Domestic animals will switch the dog food if the dog doesn't like it. If it doesn't have to be as closely fitted. Let me go down a little bit. Let's go to here. Can it be thought improbable, seeing that variation useful to man have undoubtedly occurred, that other variations useful in some way to each being in the great and complex battle of life? Okay, you may have heard the phrase survival of the fittest, and I'll tell you right now, Darwin did not come up with that phrase. That was come up by Owens, one of his friends. It made it into this edition of the book, which was one of the later, this was the 6th. Most of the anthologized pieces you'll see from Darwin are from the 6th. His earlier edition did not use it, but the battle of life was the metaphor he used to illustrate that idea. Whether or not these animals or those plants or these bacteria or whatever are going to survive is a battle for survival, but there's going to be another element. Should sometimes occur in the course of thousands of generations, not over the course of the 8 generations you are around to breed that dog. But notice, once you start dealing with something in nature, you're dealing with thousands of generations in order to get to that coyote, in order to get to that roadrunner. Cartoon allusion there. In order to get to that bacteria, in order to get to that Joshua tree, in order to get to that, you have to count thousands of generations. Can it be then thought improbable, seeing that variations useful to man undoubtedly occurred, that other variations useful in some way to each being in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur in the course of thousands of generations? Yes, things are going to happen. Variations in what we would understand as mutations are going to happen. Suddenly you're going to have a desert tortoise born who can survive the heat a little bit better, or who's a little bit faster, or who's a little bit slower and not going to burn up the calories that it has a hard time getting. For one way or another, those variations are going to happen and be selected. If such do occur, can we doubt remembering that many more individuals are born than can possibly survive? And that's a notion he took that was floating around at that time. It was going into more about human generations and societies, about the history of battles and wars and famines and plagues and other things that would wipe out large segments of the population. And that idea he took from the books he read on human, not human evolution, but human societies and how they've changed over time. When they become too productive, then there's going to be some force over time that will wipe a large portion of them out. There are many more than can survive. There are always more produced than can survive. that produces a competitive environment. You cannot have 24 teams win the Super Bowl. So when you have all these beings born, somebody's got to die and somebody's got to live. That creates a competitive, undeniably, unavoidably competitive environment. On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation and the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. That does not mean somebody will come along and say, oh, let's change that. It means you are dead. If you carry that variation to produce that characteristic, you will die under these conditions. Now, a very important notion to keep in mind, this does not lead to bigger, stronger, faster. Again, I mentioned the desert tortoise for a reason. If you're a fast, big desert tortoise, you're going to die in the first 120-degree heat summer that you encounter. You have to be a bit smaller, a good deal smaller, and you've got to move slowly so that you don't burn up many calories. And you need to not be some being who wastes things like water and sweats it out and lets it out, because you're going to only have a little bit of water to survive by. That becomes the trait, the mutation that survives under those conditions. Those are the inorganic conditions that would make otherwise impossible. Okay? This preservation of favorable variations and rejection of injurious variations, I call natural selection. Now, I'd like you to underline that because that's the first definition you get of natural selection. He's going to get to another one. That's the first. Preservation of favorable variations and rejection of injurious variations. So anything that's injurious gets rejected. Okay? Anything that's favorable gets held on to and passed on to the next generation. The proportional numbers. Okay, he talks about number 2. I'll mention 2 really quickly. He talks about if you have an island and you get any shift in the climate or any other major kind of macro change, you're going to get shifts in the proportions of any species, of all the species throughout the island. And as those proportions shift, they're going to shift others, and all of the populations are going to be shifted because the organic conditions of life have changed. So if you think about if a storm hit or something like that, or a flood happened, that is going to change the proportions. And as certain species come into the area, that's going to invite other shifts within the populations. That is the organic close-fitting relationships, or the close-fitting relationships that all organic beings have to each other. And he mentions on variability that variation can be of one of 3 types. He mentioned this in the start, but you can get variations that are favorable. You can get variations that are negative. But it's extremely important to know that you can get variations that don't matter, that make no effect on the survivability of that animal or of that plant, that it just happened. Variation does not know, has no inherent direction where it's going to go. It's just going to go somewhere. There's going to be the selection process without somebody guiding it, without a central authority guiding the process. That should tell you who Darwin read. Man selects only for his own good. Nature only for that of the being which it tends. So in other words, when you have tortoises and when you have gray whales and when you have Joshua trees, you're not going to have a human being going along and saying, we want these kind of gray whales. Instead, the process of within nature, on the competition within the beings within the groups, they worked it out and it happened. There's no central authority guiding evolution. It is the product of a competition, and it's a competition for life. Okay, so I'll hold off there, and we're going to start up with 5. And as you're going to see with 5 is essential. And the second half of this video, I'm going to go through the structure of natural selection. Right?